Well, joining me in studio now is IPSOS-Synovate political research analyst Tom Wolf. Welcome to our studios. Thank you for finding time to be with us
Nice
tonight.
to be here.
Now, Tom, traditionally the validity of these polls has been questioned by Kenyans. And let's talk about today's polls. The thinking behind a sample size of 5,895 voters out of 14 million registered voters. Let's start there.
Well, there's a whole academic science, of course, to this type of research. And unfortunately, in a discussion like this, we don't have time to explore it in detail. But I would just call first attention to the fact that if you look at most of the polls that were taken in the U.S. before the election last November, which are easily found on the internet for your viewers who are familiar doing that, the average size of those polls was 1,500 respondents. And that's in a population of over 200 million adults. Now, there's a margin of error there of plus or minus 3% and so on, which means that in a close election, even if a poll were done the day before voting, they might get it wrong. And there's also always in close elections the issue of turnout, which side is more effective in mobilizing its voters to get out. And we're still at a very early stage in this election here. But before we get into perhaps some of the other issues that would raise questions about the accuracy of this poll as a prediction of the election, which we emphasized at the briefing today, it is not. Really, a poll of a couple of thousand is fine if you make sure that it's drawn randomly. That is, it actually represents the distribution of population across the country. And just finally in that regard, Lillian, the problem here is although we used the registration figures from the IEBC to determine how many interviews we would do in each of the 47 counties to which we went, we don't yet have, none of the polling firms yet have from the IEBC, the actual demographic breakdown of the individuals who have registered. So for example, in Nairobi County, we don't know what was the percentage of men versus women. So we will use, until we get those figures, and we hope to get them soon, what we know to be the distribution from the National Bureau of Statistics for male and female in Nairobi, but that may not accurately reflect the distribution that's actually among the registered voters.
Which then brings me to this exact question, which is the question that most Kenyans ask. Who are the people that are being interviewed? Does this reflect the reality on the ground? Is this actually what is on the ground? Is it reflective of the voting patterns that we expect to see come March the 4th?
Well, those are two very good but quite different questions. The first is, are the people who are selected representative of the Kenyan population we want to explore, and that is registered voters? And we think so. Of course, when a sample is so small compared to the adult population, I'm sure that most of your viewers have never been interviewed by us or any other company, and maybe don't even know someone who has, although with the years going by, that will eventually change. Whether it actually can predict a result, as we said today, that is very problematic, and we don't like the word prediction or projection. I like the word you used in your lead, that is popularity, because that's what we're measuring. As we pointed out at the briefing this morning, for example, we did not pair any of the presidential candidates with their running mates for the simple reason that at the time we went to the field on the 12th, one important candidate, or actually two, Musalia Mudavadi and Martha Karua, had not publicly revealed or announced who their running mates would be, and we thought it would create an imbalance and it wouldn't be fair to them to match them up against other candidates who had announced their running mates. So we just asked the simple question that we'd been asking in the past: if the election were held today, who would you vote for, aside from President Kibaki, who's retiring, if that person were a candidate? Now, as from this next week, starting Monday, we have a number of surveys planned. We have put the running mates together with their presidential candidates, and that will give, or should give, a more likely result than this one, which is suggestive, indicative, shows a trend, but is in no way, even if the election were next week, suggestive of the actual result, even if we knew the turnout, because we didn't give our respondents the choice because they weren't formalized when we went to the field 10 days ago.
All right. Your polls,
15 days ago,
you've been accused as creating a bandwagon effect in the sense that you influence voting patterns. Case in point where CORD repeatedly comes as being on top in the race to State House. Your response to this?
Well, you know, there's no evidence that I've seen that proves that. In the period leading up to the last election 5 years ago, for more than a year, Vice President Kalonzo Musyoka led all comers. He was then overtaken by incumbent President Kibaki, who was then overtaken by then the leader of opposition LDP, Raila Odinga. So if there was a bandwagon effect, whoever was there at the beginning should have been there at the end. And as a matter of fact, to speak at the end, the last couple of months, our several polls showed Kalonzo Musyoka at around 10%. Right up to Election Day, our last poll 2 weeks before showed him at 10%. Statistically, on the Election Day, that's exactly what he got. And when we did a survey in March of 2008 to ask our respondents, had they been aware of polls, we found out about 70% of Kenyans before that last election had seen some polls. And we asked them if it influenced them, and very few said it had. And even those who had voted, the 10% for Kalonzo Musyoka, their votes were not changed. So I haven't seen any evidence, but I will just finish by saying, even if there was evidence that it did change votes, what's wrong with that? If people don't want to go into a runoff, for example, and at the moment they're supporting neither of the two top candidates, and they decide they would rather pick their second choice or third choice or whatever so that they can get this thing over with, I don't see there's anything wrong with that, because we know the campaign teams are using votes for their strategizing, for their campaign activities.
Right.
Why shouldn't Kenyans have access to the same information?
Right, and we'll be talking about the possibility of a runoff shortly. But let's talk about the results that you gave us on our news on Monday here on Citizen TV. You showed us that in terms of support for presidential candidates, Raila Odinga had 48% for support, Uhuru 40%, Musalia 5%, Kenneth 2%, and Karua 1%. Today's polls show different results, though not, I mean, there's not a considerable difference seen there, but then there are different results. How do you explain this?
Well, that poll, I believe that we had you release on Monday, had a sample of 2,600, 2610, I believe. This one, as you said, was nearly 6,000. So while that had a margin of error of around 1.8% plus or minus, which means it could be 3.6% either way, within the confidence level. This one, being larger, had a margin of error that was quite a bit smaller, I believe plus or minus 1.28%. So the fact that there was only a 2% change for Prime Minister Raila Odinga in a larger sample after a certain period of time, I think that's quite reasonable. There's nothing to suggest that the numbers were in any way inaccurate when the sample sizes are that different, and therefore the error margins are likewise.
When you predict a runoff, rather you said you don't like the word prediction, but when you predict a runoff, aren't you demotivating the populace into, first of all, believing in their minds that this is a two-horse race, and therefore for the electorate they might be asking themselves, why bother vote then? This is a two-horse race, there's 6 presidential candidates, and yet we're being told there's likely to be a runoff, meaning that already as IPSOS-Synovate you have rubber-stamped the fact that there are 2 presidential candidates to look at in this race.
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, that's a valid question. I would not want to have, and I wouldn't want anyone else to have, power to limit the freedom of speech or research in any country. What kind of restrictions there might be in the last couple of days before an election, we know we have an act of parliament that says no poll results should be released within the last 48 hours. I think that's very reasonable. Even in some well-established democracies, that's fine. But in the same way, if you read the papers and listen to the news, as I'm sure you do since that's your job, you've seen over the last few years a very, very detailed, focused reliance on these polls as parties have decided to choose their candidates, as certain candidates have negotiated with others for running mate positions, how much are you bringing to the table, and so on. I would also point out to you that rather than thinking about the polls as determining who can be a front runner and who isn't, we are simply capturing a reality. Moreover, those candidates who are not showing so well in the polls right now, if I'm not incorrect, all of them are first-time candidates for president, whereas the main contestants have run more than once, in one case 3 times, as President Kibaki did before he won his 3rd time around. So given the fact that name recognition, personal familiarity is so important in Kenyan politics, I wouldn't attribute too much to the impact of polls in determining electoral success.
Right. Quite a wide topic, and so much more to discuss, including the fact that there are 10 the undecided voters in the recent undecided persons in the recent polls that you've just released today. So a lot of questions that really Kenyans need answers to, and we hope that we'll get time to discuss some more of this in subsequent
That would be
bulletins.
a pleasure.
Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
We've been talking to IPSOS-Synovate political research analyst Tom Wolf as he elaborates and explains a bit about the recent polls that we've just seen today on our TV screens that say that if a presidential, rather that neither CORD flag bearer Raila Odinga nor Jubilee flag bearer Uhuru Kenyatta would clinch the presidency in the first round if elections were to be held today. And we had asked you what your views are on this. Kindly keep your comments coming on SMS number 2442 and we'll read them out as Citizen Weekend continues.